Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that might just completely change how you think about your own brain.
Oh yeah, this one is a doozy.
We're diving into The Unbearable Slowness of Being, which is a paper by Zheng and Markus Meister.
Mm,
And it is, as I said, going to be a wild ride. So to kick things off, the main idea here is this.
okay.
Our senses are basically getting slammed with information all the time. Like, just take a second to look around you. Right now, all the colors, shapes, motions, all of that, it's like a tidal wave of data, right?
Yeah, I can see that.
But here's the thing. Our brains are processing all this information at like a snail's pace.
Yeah, that's the crazy part.
We're talking something like 10 bits per second.
Yeah,
10 bits per second. That just seems crazy slow, right? Like our phones can download data thousands of times faster than that.
right. It's definitely a huge contrast to how we think about technology, that's for sure.
So how do we even function with such a limited bandwidth?
It's wild. I know. It's like if our brains actually tried to process everything our senses were throwing at us, we'd just be totally overwhelmed.
It'd be like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Exactly.
So what you're saying is our brains are like these incredibly efficient filters, picking out just the essential info.
Right. They have to be. The paper calls this filtering process the sifting number. Basically, it's like comparing how much info comes in from our senses to how much our brains actually use.
And I'm guessing this sifting number is massive.
Oh, yeah. Hugely massive. The paper estimates it to be around 10 to the 8th power.
10 to the 8th. So that means our brains are throwing away millions of bits of information for each one they keep.
It's like finding a needle in a haystack, but on a cosmic scale. It's almost impossible to comprehend how much our brains are filtering out.
So even though we're surrounded by all this data, our brains are just skimming the surface.
It's a really humbling thought, isn't it?
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
makes you wonder about what we're missing, what's going on beneath the surface, what's getting filtered out.
Right. And it also kind of debunks those myths we see in movies about super fast brains, like that scene in The Matrix where Neo instantly downloads kung fu skills. Pure fantasy.
So instant downloads for us, huh?
Nope, the paper makes it clear, even things that seem like superhuman feats of memory or processing, they're all still bound by that 10 bits per second limit.
So no matter how impressive those memory champions are, their brains are playing by the same rules as ours.
Exactly. And the paper gives some really interesting examples to illustrate this. It starts with something simple, something everyone can relate to. The game 20 Questions.
Okay, I love that game.
Imagine you're trying to figure out what someone is thinking of. Every yes-no question gives you one bit of information.
Right.
To be good at the game, you need to narrow down potentially like a million possibilities, and you've got to do it fast.
So that's the 10 bits per second in action. It's like we're constantly playing 20 questions with the world around us.
Exactly. It's a great analogy. Now let's up the ante a little. Imagine you're a really skilled typist working from a manuscript. You can type something like 120 words per minute. That's about 10 keystrokes every second. Fast, right?
Way faster than I can type.
But language is kind of sneaky. It has a lot of built-in redundancy and predictability. You know a few letters, you can often guess the next one.
So even though it feels super fast, the typist is still working within that 10 bits per second limit.
You got it. Okay, how about something that demands even more focus and quick reflexes? Like those speed cubers. Those folks have to be pushing the limits of information processing.
I mean, they make it look so effortless.
It's amazing, right? But even speed cubing, it still falls within that same range.
Yeah.
The paper uses blindfolded speed cubing as an example, where people have to memorize the cube setup first and then solve it blindfolded.
That's insane.
I know, right? And by doing that, they isolate the mental work from the physical movements of actually solving the cube.
So they can study each process separately. Smart.
Right. And what they find is that both memorizing and solving happen at roughly 10 bits per second. Even those world champion speed cubers, they split their time pretty evenly between perceiving the cube and actually moving their hands.
So they are limited.
It points to both processes operating at a similar information rate.
So even when we feel like our brains are in overdrive, we're still stuck with that speed limit.
Seems like it. And this limited bandwidth has some interesting implications. For example, it might be why our brains don't have as much storage space as we think.
Wait, really? I always thought of our brains as these vast libraries that could hold almost infinite amounts of information.
It's a common idea, but if you do the math, considering how slowly we process information and how long we live, It turns out our brains probably store far less than we imagine, maybe just a few gigabytes of information total.
A few gigabytes. That's like a tiny flash drive.
Mm.
Everything we know, all our memories, everything fits on something that small.
It's kind of shocking, isn't it? But it also shows just how incredibly efficient biological memory is. And this limited storage might actually be a big reason why we're so good at adapting to new situations.
Because we have to be picky about what we remember and how we access those memories. Like our brains are constantly tidying up, keeping the important stuff, and tossing out the rest.
You got it. Our slowness might actually be a good thing. It forces us to focus on what's really important.
So limitations can be strengths. Now that's a thought-provoking concept.
Right, so our brains are really good at filtering and prioritizing information. But what does that say about how we actually experience the world?
Are you saying that what we think is reality is really just a carefully curated highlight reel?
That's something to ponder. And it leads to another fascinating question. What if we could experience the world at the full speed of our senses, with all that unfiltered data?
Whoa, that's a bit scary, to be honest. Would we just get overloaded? Would it unlock some hidden level of perception? I don't even know if I want to know.
It's definitely mind-boggling. The paper doesn't give any easy answers, but it suggests that our slowness might be essential for having a coherent and meaningful experience of the world.
So maybe that's a good thing that we're stuck with our curated highlight reels.
Probably for the best. But this whole idea of limited processing speed, it doesn't just affect our internal world. It also has implications for how we interact with technology.
You mean like brain-computer interfaces, all that talk about downloading information directly into our brains, Matrix style?
Exactly. The paper argues that this whole approach might be flawed from the start because it doesn't take into account how slow our cognitive processes actually are. They even suggest that language, as limited as it may seem, is already an incredibly efficient way to communicate complex information.
So why try to reinvent the wheel?
Exactly. And this isn't just about communication, it's about how we use technology in general. The paper proposes that instead of trying to create interfaces that directly tap into the high bandwidth signals of our senses and motor systems, we should focus on devices that communicate key information in a way that our slow brains can actually understand.
So instead of trying to replicate the full sensory experience, we should be trying to convey the most important information in a way that's, well, brain-friendly.
Precisely. For example, think about devices for people who are visually impaired. Instead of trying to reproduce the entire visual experience, which has been really, really difficult, why not focus on communicating the most critical information through language? Imagine a device that can identify objects and people and then just tell the user what's there in real time. It wouldn't be the same as seeing, of course, but it would be a powerful way to navigate the world.
That's a great example of how understanding our limitations can lead to more effective solutions. Work with our biology, not against it.
Exactly. So we've established that we're remarkably slow processors. But the question is, why? What's the reason? Why are our brains so stingy with information?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I'm guessing the paper has some thoughts on this.
It does. One idea is that it all goes back to our evolutionary history. Our brains could be limited by their ancient origins as systems for basically helping us move around. Think about the earliest nervous systems, like in simple creatures navigating their environments.
Like a jellyfish. They don't need to multitask, they just need to figure out where to go for food.
Right. For those early organisms, it was all about survival, reacting quickly to threats and opportunities.
So they had to be laser-focused on the task at hand.
Exactly. And this focus on single tasks, this what we call serial processing, might have been carried through as brains became more complex, shaping how we think today.
So even though we can think abstract thoughts and solve complex problems, we're still fundamentally limited by that ancient drive to navigate the world one step at a time.
It's a fascinating perspective, isn't it? And it explains why we can only really focus on one thing at a time. The paper uses some great examples to illustrate this point, like the cocktail party effect. You're in a crowded room, tons of conversations going on, but you can only really tune into one at a time.
Right. Or think about playing chess. Even grandmasters, those brilliant minds, they don't evaluate multiple moves simultaneously.
Yeah.
They have to consider each one in turn.
You got it. And this brings us to the idea of the complexity bottleneck, the idea that there's some central resource in the brain that limits how many things we can think about at once.
So our brains are slow, But there's also a limit to how much they can juggle at once. Like, there's
Mhm.
only so much mental RAM available.
That's the hypothesis, but the paper doesn't give a definitive answer about what this bottleneck might be. Interestingly, it points out that a lot of the functions we associate with this bottleneck, like making decisions or working memory, those don't seem that demanding from a neural processing perspective.
So if it's not those things, then what is it? What's the missing piece?
That's a big question the paper leaves us with. There's still so much we don't know about how our brains work, especially when it comes to those higher level cognitive functions.
So we've got this complexity bottleneck. We just don't know exactly what it is or how it works. This is getting pretty complex.
I know, right?
How do scientists even begin to study something like that?
It is super complex, but the paper does offer a framework for thinking about these questions. They use the idea of an outer brain versus an inner brain to help us understand how these different levels of processing might be working together.
Okay, I like that. Outer brain versus inner brain. What's the difference?
The outer brain is all about high bandwidth sensory and motor signals. It's the part that's always interacting with the world, taking in information through our senses, and sending commands to our muscles. The inner brain, on the other hand, operates on a much smaller scale. It takes that flood of data from the outer brain and processes it so we can make decisions and take action.
So the outer brain is like the information gatherer, the one drinking from the fire hose, and the inner brain is the one making sense of it all, the one trying to take a sip through a straw.
Perfect analogy. And one of the big challenges the paper highlights is how these two systems communicate. It's like trying to connect a fire hose to a drinking straw.
It's a pretty big mismatch, isn't it? You've got this torrent of information from our senses, but our inner brain can only process a trickle of it. How does that even work? What's the mechanism?
Well, the paper points to a structure in the brain called the superior colliculus, SC for short.
Okay, the superior colliculus, and what does it do?
It seems to be a key player in this whole communication process. It acts as a filter, taking in that high-dimensional sensory input and turning it into a kind of map of potential actions.
So it helps the inner brain decide what to focus on and how to react.
Exactly, like a traffic controller, directing the flow of information. And the paper even suggests that the SC might be involved in more complex things like attention.
Attention. I can see that. Attention is all about picking what to focus on and what to ignore. It's filtering.
Exactly. It highlights how closely linked our sensory and cognitive processes really are. They're inseparable.
So this superior colliculus could be a crucial piece of the puzzle in understanding that complexity bottleneck we were talking about earlier.
It's definitely a possibility. And the paper raises another really intriguing question about the inner and outer brain. Do they operate on fundamentally different principles, even though they're both made of the same basic stuff, neurons?
That is a fascinating question. It's like they both use the same building blocks, but they're doing very different things. Like the difference between a Hoover dam and a glass bottle. Both are structures, but they're made of different materials and operate on completely different scales.
It's curious, right? And the paper points out that there's actually a difference in how researchers study these two systems. Scientists studying sensory areas, they tend to zoom in on the activity of individual neurons, believing that every little electrical spike is telling us something important about the stimulus. They're looking at very high-dimensional representations of the sensory world.
Right, because each neuron in the sensory cortex has its own receptive field, like a tiny window into the world.
Exactly. But researchers studying cognitive areas like the prefrontal cortex, they often take a different approach. They're looking for patterns of activity across larger groups of neurons.
So they're more interested in the big picture than the tiny details.
That's right. And the paper poses a really provocative question. Could this difference in how we study the brain actually be misleading us? Could it be that the inner brain is much more complex than we currently realize?
So you're saying we might be missing something crucial because we're not looking at the inner brain with the same level of detail as the outer brain.
It's possible, and they offer an alternative hypothesis. What if the inner brain isn't just this simple, slow processor, but is actually juggling a really rapid sequence of what they call microtasks?
Microtasks.
Yeah.
So instead of handling one big task at a time, it's actually switching between tons of little tasks super quickly.
Exactly. And they point out that this would require some pretty complex routing and control mechanisms to manage the flow of information between all these different microtasks.
Okay, so what do you mean by microtasks? Can you give me a real-world example?
Sure. Think about something like driving. You're constantly switching between all these different tasks. Checking mirrors, reading signs, judging distances between cars, adjusting speed, steering. Each of those things, those are microtasks. Each one requires quick processing of sensory information and coordinated motor output.
And our brains manage to do all of this seamlessly. It feels like one smooth, continuous experience.
That's the thing. The paper suggests that this constant juggling of microtasks, that could be a key function of the inner brain. It's not just a slowpoke, it's like a master conductor, orchestrating a symphony of microtasks to create what we experience as consciousness.
Wow, that's a really powerful image. It's not just a simple processor, it's a multitasker extraordinaire.
Right. And it really challenges our assumptions about what the inner brain is doing. And it leads to even more questions. How does the brain coordinate all these microtasks? How does it decide what to prioritize? And how does this relate to our experience of consciousness?
So many questions. This is really making me rethink what's going on inside my own head. We've covered so much ground already, but it feels like we're just getting started.
I know, right? It's
Yeah,
amazing to think about. So before we went off, we were talking about this idea that our brains are constantly juggling all these microtasks. It's a pretty different way of thinking about the brain compared to that traditional view of it as a single task processor.
it is. It's almost like our brains are running some complex operating system in the background, always allocating resources and switching between different programs, and we have no idea it's even happening.
Exactly. Which makes you wonder, what would happen if we could somehow become aware of these microtasks? Would it change how we see the world?
Whoa. Now that's a trippy thought. Would it be like suddenly seeing the Matrix code? Or would it just be a bunch of meaningless neural noise?
It's hard to say for sure, but the paper does suggest that our conscious experience might be more fragmented, more broken up than we think.
Okay, so how does that connect to this complexity bottleneck idea? Is it just that our brains are too slow to process all these microtasks at the same time?
That's one possibility, but it could also be that the bottleneck comes from how all these different microtasks are integrated and coordinated. Like imagine trying to run a bunch of programs on a computer that doesn't have enough processing power. Things are going to slow down, get choppy.
So it's not just about the raw speed of different brain regions. It's about how efficiently they can talk to each other.
Exactly. And that might be why some cognitive tasks feel harder than others. Tasks that require us to switch between different types of processing or put together information from different sources, those are the ones that are more likely to hit that complexity bottleneck.
It's like when you're trying to have a phone conversation while driving in rush hour traffic. It can feel so mentally draining.
Exactly. And it really emphasizes that our cognitive limits aren't just about how fast individual neurons or brain regions are. It's about the whole system, how all those parts work together. It's about information flow.
Okay, so we've got this concept of a complexity bottleneck, but we still don't know exactly what it is or how it works. What does the paper say about how we can figure this out? What are some of the research directions it suggests?
They propose some pretty exciting avenues. One is to move beyond those simple lab tasks and actually study how the brain works in more realistic situations. Because, let's be honest, in the real world, we're almost never focusing on just one thing at a time.
True, we're always juggling tasks, shifting our attention, taking in information from our senses.
Right. And by studying the brain in these more complex and dynamic situations, we might discover new things about this complexity bottleneck. The paper also suggests that we need better tools and techniques to measure and analyze brain activity in much finer detail.
Because our current methods might be missing some of the subtle but really important patterns of brain activity that are behind this bottleneck.
Exactly. They highlight the need for approaches that can capture what lots of neurons are doing all at the same time and also look at the intricate connections between different brain areas. It's like we need to see the forest and the trees all at once.
So like we need a higher resolution picture of the brain in action to see all those tiny details of the symphony being conducted.
Perfect analogy. And that brings us back to that main paradox the paper explores, this whole unbearable slowness of being. Even though our brains process information surprisingly slowly, we can do amazing things, cognitively and creatively.
We write poems, compose music, solve complex math problems, all while working with this 10 bits per second limit. It doesn't seem to make sense.
It really speaks to how powerful and efficient biological systems can be. It almost suggests that this slowness might not be a bad thing, but actually a key ingredient in how we make sense of the world and create meaning from our experiences.
Maybe it's about making the most of the limited information we have, like a sculptor who can create a masterpiece from a single block of marble.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It challenges us to rethink what we value about intelligence. Maybe it's not about pure processing speed or multitasking ability. Maybe it's about the ability to focus selectively, make connections, and create meaning from that small amount of information we have.
It's about quality over quantity,
Yeah.
depth over breadth.
Exactly. And it brings up another really interesting question from the paper. If our inner brains are always switching between these microtasks, is this feeling we have of a continuous flowing consciousness, is that just an illusion? Are we really living in a carefully edited highlight reel of reality?
Wow, that's a heavy thought. I'm not sure I'm quite ready to give up on the idea of a unified self just yet.
I get it. It's a tough concept to grasp, but it's one that the paper forces us to consider. Our conscious experience might not be as simple as we tend to think it is.
Okay, so let's say for a moment that this theory is right. What does it mean? Does it change how we should live our lives?
That's a huge question, and one that the paper doesn't try to answer directly. But it does hint that this slowness, this limited processing capacity, might actually be a gift.
A gift. How so?
Think about it. If our brains were constantly hit with all that data from our senses, the full fire hose, we'd be totally overwhelmed. We'd be paralyzed by indecision.
It'd be like trying to drink from a fire hose again.
Exactly. But our slowness, our selectivity, that's what lets us filter out all the noise and zero in on what really matters. It helps us create a coherent story out of all the chaos of experience.
So our brains are basically storytellers, weaving a narrative about who we are and how we fit into the world.
Precisely. And this story might be more fiction than fact, but that doesn't mean it's not important. It's what gives our lives meaning and purpose.
Okay, so maybe this slowness isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's what makes us human.
It's certainly a possibility worth thinking about, and it reminds us that our limitations can often be our greatest strengths.
This whole discussion has really changed how I see things. I'm looking at my own brain in a whole new light. It's not just this biological computer crunching numbers and data. It's a storyteller, an artist, a meaning maker.
And it's incredibly efficient, especially considering how limited its resources are.
That's true. We've talked a lot about how slow our brains are, but we can't forget that they're also amazingly powerful and adaptable. They would allow us to build civilizations, create art, explore the universe.
It's a testament to the incredible power of evolution. Our brains might be slow, but they're also incredibly complex and endlessly fascinating.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to take a little break. We'll be right back to wrap up our deep dive into the unbearable slowness of being. And we are back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into the unbearable slowness of being. Before we took a break, we were really getting into some pretty deep stuff like, is our sense of self, that feeling of a continuous flow of consciousness, is that all just an illusion created by our slow, multitasking brains?
It's a pretty wild idea to think about, isn't it? And the paper definitely doesn't shy away from those big questions. It suggests that our inner world might be way more fragmented, more broken up than we realize.
Okay, so let's try to unpack this a little bit. We've been talking about how our brains are always juggling all these micro tasks, these little bits of processing that kind of pop in and out of our awareness.
Right. Every time you move your eyes to look at something new, every time you shift your attention, even when you make a small decision, each one of those could be its own microtask with its own set of neural processes happening.
So it's like our brains are constantly jumping between all these tasks, creating this sort of mental montage. And somehow we experience it all as this smooth, unbroken stream of thought.
That's the big mystery, right? The paper proposes that our feeling of having a unified self might be a kind of narrative trick, a way for our brains to make sense of all these little bits and pieces of activity.
Okay, but how does that actually work?
Yeah.
How does the brain pull together all these different threads of experience into one big tapestry?
That's where things get really interesting. The paper suggests that the key might be in how our brains deal with time.
Time. All right, I'm intrigued. How does our perception of time fit into all of this?
Well, they point out that our experience of time isn't this simple linear flow like we often imagine. It gets warped and distorted by all sorts of things. Our attention, our emotions, how complex the thing we're doing is.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've all had those moments where time seems to speed up or slow down, depending on what's going on or how we're feeling.
Exactly. And those changes in how we experience time, those subjective shifts, they suggest that time isn't just this objective external thing. It's actively constructed by our brains.
So our brains are basically playing tricks on us with our sense of time. That's crazy. But how does that explain this sense of having a unified self?
The paper proposes that our inner brains might be creating a kind of temporal map, something that connects all those different microtasks together. It's like they're putting all these little moments of experience onto a timeline so it feels continuous and coherent.
So it's not that our brains are processing everything in real time. It's more like they're carefully editing and organizing these snapshots of experience, creating a story that we experience as me.
That's a fantastic way to think about it. And this editing process, this way of manipulating time, that might be what allows us to make meaning and find purpose in our lives. Instead of being overwhelmed by a constant barrage of sensory input, our brains filter and organize it all, creating a story that highlights the events and experiences that matter most.
So you're saying that this unbearable slowness, this limit in our processing speed, could actually be the key to what makes us human.
It's a radical idea, but the paper makes a pretty strong case for it. Maybe it's not about raw processing speed or the ability to multitask. Maybe it's this slow, deliberate way of handling information, this careful selection of experiences that allows us to truly appreciate the world and find meaning in our lives.
It's like our brains are always telling stories, not just about the world around us, but about ourselves too. We're each the main character in our own personal narratives, and our brains are the ones writing the story.
I love that. And it makes me think about artificial intelligence. If we want to create machines that can really understand the world, maybe we need to build in some of these same limitations.
Are you suggesting that AI might need a bit of that unbearable slowness to become truly intelligent?
It's worth considering. If we just keep focusing on building machines that can process information faster and faster, we might be missing the whole point. Maybe true intelligence isn't about speed. Maybe it's about depth, about the ability to create meaning and tell stories from all the chaos and complexity of the world.
This whole discussion has really flipped my perspective.
Oh,
I'm seeing my own brain in a whole new light. It's not just some biological machine crunching numbers. It's a storyteller, an artist, a meaning maker.
and it's an incredibly efficient one at that, especially given how little it has to work with.
Exactly. We've spent this whole deep dive talking about how slow our brains are, but it's important to remember that they're also unbelievably powerful and adaptable. They're what allow us to build societies, create art, explore the universe.
It's truly a testament to the power of evolution. Our brains might be slow, but they're also beautifully complex and endlessly fascinating.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up. Thank you to everyone who joined us on this journey into the surprising world of the slow brain. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the hidden depths of your own mind and maybe even discovered that sometimes slow and steady really does win the race. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, even if it is at a leisurely 10 bits per second.